Morning in the quiet outskirts of Fairhaven began with paper-thin sunlight slipping over the windowsill, threading through the white curtains, and pooling onto the pale wooden floor. In the small house tucked at the end of Hickory Lane, 13-year-old Karen Carter, her long brown hair tied loosely with a cloth ribbon, sat at her worn-out desk, legs dangling above the floor, eyes focused on her 8th-grade math notebook. Beside her was a silent, steady presence. Axel. Axel, a retired German shepherd who had served years in the police force, wasn't lying in his usual spots, the front door or the middle rug. Today, he lay right by Karen's feet, his head resting gently on her thigh, dark brown eyes half shut but ears alert, his body still and vigilant. He didn't need to guard anyone now, no threats, no criminals. But somehow, he understood. His new mission wasn't to track, sense, or bring down suspects anymore. It was to protect the calm, steady breaths of a young girl learning to stand up in a world that had just cracked open beneath her feet. From the kitchen came the soft clang of pans. Margaret, Karen's grandmother, was busy making breakfast. She was a woman used to silence, to mornings filled only with the clink of spoons and the ticking of a wall clock. That had been the way of things since her daughter, Karen's mother, moved out after a rough divorce. Since then, it had been just the two of them, and one dog living together like 3 worn puzzle pieces that somehow still fit, each carrying quiet scars they never named. Then, suddenly, Margaret froze mid-motion as she reached for the salt jar on the shelf. She staggered, her left hand grasping the edge of the counter. The jar slipped from her fingers and crashed to the floor, salt spilling across the warm kitchen tiles like a dusting of snow. No scream, no call for help, but Axel was already on his feet before Karen could register what was happening. He shot toward the kitchen, slipping through the narrow doorway like a gray-brown arrow. In a fluid motion perfected over years of training, he nudged against Margaret's leg, just enough for her to steady herself against his solid body. Then he backed up, raised his head, and let out a low, deliberate growl. Not threatening, but commanding attention. Karen rushed in, heart pounding. The moment she saw her grandmother leaning on Axel, pale-faced. She didn't panic. She didn't ask questions. She simply picked up the phone and dialed the family doctor, just as her grandmother had taught her. When the ambulance arrived, Margaret had stabilized. It was only a minor drop in blood pressure, but without Axel, who knew what might have happened. Later, while the paramedics checked Margaret on the sofa, Axel returned to Karen's side. He didn't jump on her, didn't lick her hand, or nuzzle into her like most dogs might. He simply walked over, laid his head on her lap again, as if completing a mission, and as if nothing had happened at all. Karen placed a hand on his head, gently stroking the thick, silver-flecked fur around his neck. "You're strange, Axel," she whispered, eyes still glassy with tears. Axel didn't respond. He never needed to. In the quiet between them, something passed that was deeper than words. Perhaps it was the purest kind of love, the kind that doesn't need to be named and doesn't ask for anything in return. It simply shows up when you need it most. And in that seemingly ordinary morning, Karen had no way of knowing that Axel's first action, small, quiet, had set in motion a chain of events that would change her life forever. One dog, one girl, and something no human could quite explain, waiting just around the bend. That morning, Fairhaven carried a strange stillness. Clouds hung low, and the sun filtered through the haze like light diluted in water. Dim, but not cold. In the Carter kitchen, the radio murmured its usual morning news: a traffic jam on Highway 35, an incoming seasonal wind, and an old update about the town planning to replace its bus system by fall. Karen finished her second piece of toast and stood up. Her grandmother, Margaret, was watering the lavender pots on the porch and called out hoarsely, "Don't forget your scarf, it's chilly today." Karen turned back, grabbed her beige knit scarf, slung on her backpack, and headed out the door. Axel was already waiting. The German shepherd stood at the bottom step, head slightly tilted as if measuring something in the air. No wagging tail, no playful bounce like usual. Karen smiled and looped her hand through the leash. "Let's go, Captain." Calling Axel Captain was her inside joke. She knew he used to be a real K9, a police dog involved in missions she'd only heard scraps about from her grandmother or old news clippings tucked in drawers. Axel had sniffed out explosives, led people out of collapsed buildings, and done incredible things with absolute silence. Now, he was just a retired dog living in her grandma's backyard. But sometimes Karen wondered, maybe Axel never really retired. Some instincts don't need a command to kick in. From the top of the hill came the rumble of a heavy engine. The school bus, a weathered yellow thing with a faded route number, rolled slowly forward, its wheels crunching gravel. It was the same bus Karen took every morning, driven by old Mr. Lawrence, who always wore reading glasses and hummed country tunes while picking up students. But today, there was no humming. No Mr. Lawrence waving from behind the windshield. Just the bus, and a figure behind the wheel, face obscured by unusually large black sunglasses, expressionless, unmoving. Karen stepped forward, one hand gripping her backpack strap, the other holding her scarf loosely. She placed one foot on the first step when Axel growled. And in the blink of an eye, he lunged, snatched the hem of Karen's dress in his teeth, and yanked her back hard. She hit the concrete, her knee stinging, stunned and angry. "Axel, are you crazy?" she shouted, equal parts embarrassed and hurt. On the porch, Margaret dropped her watering can in shock. Water splashed across the steps. Karen scrambled to her feet, ready to scold the dog. But then she stopped. Axel was trembling, not in fear, but the way a seasoned soldier might when they catch the scent of a delayed explosive. He wasn't looking at Karen. He was locked onto the bus driver, body low, ears pinned back, nostrils flaring. Not fear, not confusion. This was the posture of a wolf who had just sensed a predator. The driver didn't move, didn't look down, didn't nod, didn't lower the window. Nothing. Just an eerie stillness, as if a hollow shell sat behind the wheel. The doors hissed shut. The bus pulled away, turning onto the main road. No glance back. Karen stood, her hands shaking as she picked up the dropped scarf. Her scraped knee was bleeding, but she didn't notice. Her eyes followed the bus until it disappeared, and Axel, still braced, hadn't relaxed a muscle. A cold jolt passed through her like a metal rod pressed to her spine. She crouched beside him. "Axel," she called softly. He turned, brown eyes glittering like shattered glass. Karen slowly reached out and stroked his head. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure what she'd just been saved from. She had never missed the bus before. But this morning, she didn't want to go anymore. From the porch, Margaret watched it all with a vague sense of dread. Something was off. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a random reaction. She turned and went inside to pick up the phone. Axel turned once more, this time staring at the empty spot where the bus had been. His ears twitched. No wind, no horns, but in his eyes was something he had sensed, not with his nose, but with the instinct of one who had looked death in the face before. In just 3 seconds, Karen stepping up, Axel biting lightly, the bus pausing once before continuing, it all passed like a blur. But in those 3 seconds, something changed forever. Karen didn't know what she had just escaped, but Axel did, and he didn't need to say a word. The afternoon passed in a strange kind of silence. Margaret's house, tucked at the end of Hickory Lane, a place that was always quiet, now felt as though it had been severed from the rest of the world. No one called to check in as usual. No neighborhood kids dashed across the yard. Even the birds that usually chirped from the maple tree by the gate had fallen oddly mute. Karen sat at the dining table, eyes fixed on a cup of cocoa long gone cold. Since that morning's events, her mind had been floating in a different layer of reality, where the familiar had turned blurred and dreamlike. She wasn't even sure anymore if that school bus had been real the way she remembered it. And the driver, was he even a person? Axel lay beneath the table, head resting on Karen's thin legs. Every so often he would lift his head, ears twitching at the faintest noise from beyond the window. Not the usual kind of listening. It was as if Axel was counting the heartbeats of space, searching for frequencies only creatures who had once lived on the edge of life and death could sense. In the kitchen corner, Margaret powered up her old computer. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened an email from their neighbor, Carol, who had sent a link from her Ring doorbell system. "Carol always has cameras everywhere," she muttered, not turning around. "Today, thank God she did." Karen didn't respond. She simply pulled her chair closer, and both of them fixed their eyes on the screen. The video began. Fairhaven appeared exactly as it always did. The row of trees behind Carol's backyard, the warped "Drive Safe" sign at the street corner, the little wooden bench beneath the maple tree where Karen used to sit and read last summer. Everything looked normal, peaceful, harmless. Then Karen appeared, stepping briskly out the gate, scarf fluttering in the breeze, Axel steady at her side. She smiled and waved toward her grandmother on the porch. A moment so ordinary that no one would have thought to remember it. But the next part froze the air in the room. The bus rolled into the frame. Dull yellow paint, a route number so faded it was barely visible. Karen approached. Axel suddenly halted. Then, in an instant, he lunged forward, bit the hem of Karen's dress, and yanked her backward. She fell, hands bracing behind her, eyes wide with shock. Everything happened just as they remembered. But now, from this angle, they saw something the human eye hadn't caught. The driver didn't move, not a tilt of the head, not a flicker, no hands lifted, no neck turned. He sat there in absolute stillness, as if no nerves fired, no muscles flexed, no instinct remained. Karen leaned back in her chair. "That's not right," she whispered, as if lost in a playback of her memory. Margaret said nothing. She dragged the video slider back a few seconds, then paused. "Look at his face," she said. Karen squinted. The man behind the windshield, or rather the thing behind the wheel, wore dark sunglasses that covered most of his face. But in frame 22, there was a glitch. Unclear whether it came from the camera or the figure itself. The left cheek tugged downward unnaturally, sliding like a faulty graphic render. The mouth didn't match the chin. The facial features were too smooth, too symmetrical. No pores, no wrinkles, no micro-movements. It looked human, but it wasn't. "A fake?" Karen asked, voice dry. "Something without a heartbeat," Margaret replied, almost in a whisper. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Margaret opened a drawer and gently laid a small, worn notebook on the table. It was the journal she had kept when Axel first came to live with them. Inside were details of his background, including his time with the state-level K9 unit, and one note written in red pen. "Special response to ultra-low frequency sound, due to advanced training program." "Axel doesn't react with his eyes. He doesn't need visuals," Margaret said, tapping the note. "He hears things we don't." Karen looked down. Axel still lay at her feet, head resting on her legs. But he wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open, pupils like mirrors reflecting the paused frame of the driver frozen on the laptop screen. "You saw it before any of us, didn't you?" Karen whispered. Axel flicked an ear slightly, but gave no response. And she didn't need one. Because it was clear. In that fleeting moment when no one else noticed anything wrong, Axel had thrown his entire body in her path, to stop her from boarding a bus that might never have stopped at any school marked on a map. No one knew what might have happened if Karen had placed her other foot on the step, but Axel knew. Just then, Margaret stood and drew the curtains shut. The room dimmed, bathed in a reddish glow like dusk. Not out of fear, but because they knew from this point forward, mornings would no longer be what they were yesterday. Everything had begun to change. Not with a scream, not with a gunshot, but with a single stare from behind the glass. Since Margaret and Karen had watched the video the previous afternoon, something subtle yet certain had shifted in the air around the house at the end of Hickory Lane. It wasn't overt fear, nor sudden paranoia, but something quieter, like a chill wind slipping through the cracks of daily life, leaving a feeling that prickled the skin in a way that couldn't be named, but also couldn't be ignored. That day, the sky was still cloudy. The wind wasn't strong, but it stirred the small lavender pots on the porch. Margaret's ritual of normalcy she clung to like a lifeline. In the heavy silence of the neighborhood, the old cream-colored landline rang 3 times. The first 2 were from neighbors who used to send Christmas cards. The third was from Mrs. Trudy Matlin, president of the local homeowners association, a woman always seen with tightly curled hair and a voice that carried a subtle form of authority, the kind that was difficult to oppose. The call didn't last long. Trudy never said anything directly accusing or demanding, but every word was laced with implication, as if laying the groundwork for a quiet excommunication. She spoke of reasonable community concerns, of preventable risks, and ended with what she called a well-meaning suggestion. Perhaps it's time to consider sending the dog back to the training center, just for an evaluation, in case he's showing signs of post-service trauma. Margaret gave nothing in return but a curt thank you, but the judgment had already begun. And as with all things in small towns, where there isn't much else to talk about, rumors found a way to spread faster than facts. By that afternoon, whispers circulated that Axel had served in special units, that retired K-9s could become unstable, and that they were unpredictable around children. Someone said his eyes looked strange. Another insisted, those dogs never forget how to attack. Karen never heard the words directly, but she felt their echo, in how neighbors avoided eye contact at the grocery store, in the awkward silence from the mailman who used to pet Axel every morning, and in the quiet sigh Margaret let out as she folded the morning paper and placed it face down on the table. By evening, Karen hadn't left her room. No internet, no reading, no homework. Just lying still, face buried in the pillow, staring at the ceiling where a thin crack ran diagonally across the corner. Something that had always been there, unnoticed. But today, it stood out starkly. In her mind, the video played on an endless loop. The metallic hiss of the bus door closing, the expressionless face behind the black lenses, and the way Axel trembled. Not out of fear, but because he had sensed something no human could name. Karen wasn't angry at Axel, not once, but she didn't know who she could talk to and be believed. She couldn't tell anyone her dog had saved her from a bus with no true driver. She couldn't point at a blurry glitch and convince anyone something was wrong, and she certainly couldn't stop the whispers that grew louder just beyond their worn wooden gate. Night came sooner than usual. The air in her room grew thick, as if the cold outside had begun seeping through the walls. She didn't turn on the lights, just pulled the blanket up to her chest and stared into the dark that was slowly filling every corner. Then, as the clock quietly struck 8, she heard footsteps on the wooden floor. Software steady, not rushed, not hesitant. The familiar rhythm of claws tapping wood. A wordless lullaby she had listened to for over a year. Axel. He entered without pushing the door open hard. No scratching, no whining, just walked straight in as if he'd been invited. Karen didn't turn around. She only listened, waited. It felt like he was searching for something in the dark, or perhaps bringing something with him. A few seconds later, something soft dropped onto the rug beside her bed. Karen sat up and reached for the lamp. The soft amber glow didn't light the whole room, but it was enough to reveal a worn, old stuffed bunny, its fabric frayed, one ear missing. The toy she used to hold every night when she was in preschool. She froze. Axel sat beneath her, head tilted slightly. No barking, no pawing for affection, just watching her, those deep brown eyes like quiet pools. And waiting. No apology, no plea, no defense. Karen leaned down, hands trembling as she picked up the stuffed bunny. Memories poured back with piercing clarity. The first night she slept at her grandmother's when her parents' fights had begun to stretch into days. The time Axel laid his head on her lap when she cried without a sound after switching schools, and all those freezing winter nights when he had been the only warmth left in a world collapsing around her. She sank to the floor, wrapped her arms around Axel's neck, and buried her face in the thick fur at his shoulder. He didn't move, just gently pressed his head to her chest and closed his eyes. At that moment, there were no words, no explanations, no asking why or are you okay? Only one certainty, the presence, a loyalty that didn't need understanding, a love that never asked to be defended. Karen didn't need the world to believe her. Not tonight. As long as Axel was there, steady at her side, even the unexplainable could be endured, and survived. The next morning, sunlight slanted through the living room curtains, not strong enough to dispel the heaviness that lingered from the night before. Everything in the small house remained untouched. The half-finished cup of tea on the table, Margaret's notebook still open to a page marked in red, and the worn-out stuffed bunny resting carefully atop the cabinet, a silent witness to something deeper than any argument or defense. Karen woke earlier than usual. She splashed her face with cold water, got dressed, and came downstairs with an oddly composed air. Not because she had found answers, but because a quiet decision had settled inside her. If the adults didn't believe what she had seen with her own eyes, then at the very least, they would have to see it for themselves. At exactly 8:45, the doorbell rang. Axel, as if he had been waiting, stood up from his spot in the corner and walked to the door without being called. He didn't bark. He didn't wag his tail. He simply stood there, a silent figure, eyes pulled taut like a drawn bow. Karen opened the door. Standing before her was a tall, lean man with short black hair, a neatly pressed police uniform, and a name tag that read, D. Rodriguez. He didn't carry the cocky demeanor that some young officers wore like armor. Instead, there was a restraint to him, a steady gaze, and a kind of calm one only learned after hearing too many stories they weren't allowed to believe, but still had to treat as real. "Mrs. Margaret Carter?" he asked, though his eyes gently shifted to Karen. "My grandma's in the kitchen. I'm Karen. She's the one who called the police, but I think Axel's the reason you're here." Daniel nodded slightly, and when his eyes landed on the dog by the door, something subtle shifted in his expression. Not suspicion, but recognition. He knew that stance, that unblinking focus. K9s he had worked with used to stand the same way. Most of them were gone now. Axel didn't move. He stared at the stranger as if scanning every detail of his uniform, the twitch of his right hand near his belt buckle. Only when Daniel gave a respectful nod did Axel step aside. Just one deliberate move, as if giving silent approval. This one may enter. In the living room, Margaret poured tea without speaking. Karen plugged a USB drive into her laptop and steadied herself as the ring cam footage loaded. "I think you should see this first," she said. Daniel didn't interrupt. He pulled up a chair and sat beside Axel, who hadn't left Karen's side since morning. As the footage played, Daniel watched in silence, never blinking, occasionally nodding at key timestamps. When the bus stopped, when Karen stepped onto the first step, when Axel yanked her back, Daniel's eyes narrowed. But it wasn't until frame 22, when the driver's face distorted like a broken render, that Daniel leaned forward and instinctively touched his chest, as though checking the heartbeat that had just skipped. "Can you zoom in?" he asked. Karen tried. The image pixelated, but what remained was undeniable. That thing behind the wheel wasn't human. A lifeless face, eyes concealed by opaque sunglasses that reflected nothing, skin so smooth it looked artificial, like a puppet operated from elsewhere. As the sound of the bus door hissing closed played again, Axel stood and moved in front of the screen. No barking, no aggression, just standing there, body angled toward Karen. Exactly how a trained bodyguard would react when danger approached their charge. Daniel said nothing. He looked at Karen, then Axel, then Margaret, who had yet to speak, but whose eyes shimmered now with unshed tears. "He's not unstable," Daniel said slowly, clearly. "He knows something. Probably before anyone realized something was wrong." Karen didn't reply. She just reached for Axel's collar, not to hold him back, but as if anchoring herself to something steady when the floor no longer felt solid beneath her. Daniel pulled out his phone and asked permission to record the video again. He promised to send it to the department's technical unit to cross-reference bus schedules and driver records, and if necessary, he'd return it himself. Before leaving, he crouched to Axel's level. He didn't pat the dog's head like most people did. He simply looked straight into his eyes, as one soldier greeting another. "You're a damn good protector," he whispered, "and I won't let them misunderstand you." Axel didn't move. He just tilted his head slightly, gaze fixed on Daniel, as if confirming an unspoken alliance between those who had seen and those who believed. The door closed. Karen stood still for a moment, then turned and walked back inside. Axel followed, needing no summons. Everything seemed unchanged. The pale blue walls, the curtains still shifting with the breeze, and the afternoon sun cutting diagonally through the darkened glass. But something had solidified inside Karen. Axel wasn't just a rescue dog brought home from a shelter. He was part of something she didn't yet understand, but had begun to believe. And whatever was behind that bus window knew it too. After leaving the house at the end of Hickory Lane, Daniel Rodriguez didn't drive straight back to the police station as originally planned. Instead, he pulled into an old gas station where the Wi-Fi was weak and cell signal barely held one bar, the kind of place veteran cops called a thinking spot. He opened his laptop, plugged in his headphones, and replayed the video Karen had copied for him. Once, twice. The third time, he slowed the playback beyond standard technical limits, trying to hold each frame still. And just as he'd sensed earlier, every time the bus driver's head tilted, the video glitched for a fraction of a second. Not the kind of error caused by camera defects. No, these were artifacts of compression, intentionally left behind. They weren't accidents. They were markers. Daniel took a deep breath. The air in the car felt heavier, as if unanswered questions were draining the oxygen from the cabin. He picked up his phone and dialed Fairhaven's traffic management department, a place he'd collaborated with before during a school bus collision investigation. "Hi, this is Rodriguez, Unit 24. I need to confirm the route for bus number 77 yesterday morning, the one that should have passed Hickory Drive around 7:15. The voice on the other end hesitated. "Are you sure about number 77? That route's been decommissioned since February. There's no active bus assigned to it." Daniel frowned. "I'm talking about yesterday. There was no registered bus through Hickory yesterday morning. GPS logs show no vehicle activity in that area." He tapped the steering wheel lightly. "What about driver records? Anyone named James Lynch or similar?" Another pause. Typing sounds, then, "No one by that name in current or archived files. Rodriguez, are you sure this isn't a clerical error?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared out the windshield as a truck rumbled past, kicking up dust on the road. "I don't think this is an error anymore, Sally." That afternoon, Daniel returned to the station. He submitted the footage to the Image Forensics Department, requesting a full file structure analysis. At the same time, he pulled traffic cam footage from the intersection where the bus had last been seen. And that's when the strangest revelation emerged. The yellow bus, clearly captured by Carol's home camera, was completely absent from all traffic surveillance tapes. Not at the main intersection, not at the stop near the high school, not even at the grocery store corner, which had its private security feed. Daniel swept every traffic cam within a 1-mile radius of Hickory. Nothing. It was as if the bus had evaporated after turning the corner. But one park camera finally yielded something. On frame 184, blurry, distant, a dull yellow shape crept into the edge of the frame, then vanished behind a row of bare trees. No license plate, no visible driver, and most importantly, it never returned. Daniel printed each frame, marked coordinates, and scribbled notes like a man trying to reconstruct the shadow of a forgotten dream. Every source told him the same thing. No bus was scheduled, registered, or recorded passing through Hickory that morning. So what had stopped in front of Karen's house? Who, or what, sat behind the wheel, unmoving, face smeared as if not fully rendered? And why had Axel reacted before any system recorded a threat? Back at his desk, Daniel stared at the printed image of the driver's distorted face. Depthless, warped, like a rejected prototype. Beside it, another photo. Axel standing in front of Karen, gaze locked on the screen, as if anticipating each frame before it appeared. "What did you see, buddy?" Daniel whispered, brushing his fingers along the edge of the photo. And for the first time in his career, he understood something no police training had ever covered. Some dogs don't just sniff bombs or chase criminals. Some of them see what humans have forgotten how to recognize. They don't need data. They don't need proof. They just need to be believed. And Axel, the old dog supposedly retired from duty, might be the last creature in town who truly understood. What showed up that morning wasn't a glitch. It was a warning. After a long night filled with unease and an unsent report sitting untouched on his desk, Daniel Rodriguez returned to Hickory Drive at dawn. Not with sirens, not with warrants. He didn't know exactly why. He only knew that the image of the dog standing before the screen like a lone soldier during yesterday's video playback had burned itself into his thoughts and refused to leave. Something still lingered, unspoken, unseen, but drawing near. Margaret's house looked the same. Lavender pots swaying gently in the wind, the wooden porch silent, and early sunlight washing over the white picket fence like nothing had ever happened. But when Daniel pulled up outside, Axel was already there. He didn't bark. He didn't greet Daniel like a familiar face. He simply stared, as though he had sensed something approaching. Daniel stepped out, hand barely touching the gate when a sound reached his ears. Soft but off, the whisper of tires brushing damp pavement. Not loud enough to be braking, not slow enough to be a casual pass. He turned his head. A white van, no license plate, sat just over 10 meters away, half submerged in tree shadow. The front windows were tinted dark. Nothing could be seen inside. No logos, no markings, nothing to suggest it belonged to any service or work crew in the area. Daniel narrowed his eyes and reached for his radio. At that exact moment, Axel growled. A deep, sustained sound like an underwater tremor rising through a sleeping city. It wasn't fear. It wasn't a typical warning. It was recognition. He didn't lunge, didn't bark. He just planted himself firmly in front of the gate, fur raised along his back, mouth slightly parted, every muscle pulled taut like a wire ready to snap. Karen, who had run out onto the porch after hearing Axel, froze. The moment her eyes landed on the white van, the wind seemed to stop. That second stretched unnaturally long because she knew she'd seen that van before. Not on the street in her dream last night. A dream choked in fog, where she stood alone in an empty lot surrounded by blurred shadows, and a license plateless van rolled forward soundlessly, without a driver, as if drawn by an invisible force toward her. Daniel pressed his radio hard. Unit 24, requesting verification on a suspicious vehicle. A white van, no plates. Location Hickory Drive, currently idling opposite house number 57. No visible threat yet, but the van's engine roared to life. No horn, no turn signal, no glance back. It peeled away with impossible speed, far too fast for a bulky utility van, its tires skimming the pavement like they were barely tethered to reality. Daniel bolted to his patrol car, but only managed to catch a brief glimpse of the front license plate, badly scratched. His dashcam couldn't capture a clear image. Sunlight flared across the windshield, but on replay, he noticed something strange. The space between the hood and the glass was blurred, smudged like the driver's face from the bus footage. Axel hadn't moved an inch. Even after the van vanished around the corner, he remained planted. Because the van hadn't come to the house. It had come for Karen. Daniel returned to the gate, locking eyes with Axel in a silent exchange. And in that moment, he understood something no police report would ever articulate. Something had marked the girl, not with technology, not with a traceable device, but with a feeling only those who had lived on the edge of life and the unspeakable could detect. Like Axel. That day, Daniel didn't leave Hickory. He stayed, sitting in his cruiser through noon, through dusk, until the streetlights flickered on. No orders, no duty log, just one truth. Karen needed guarding, and Axel, from his place on the porch, never took his eyes off the street where the van disappeared. Because he knew better than anyone else the game hadn't started. It had only just shown its face. That night, darkness fell thick, as though the sky had been drained of all color. No stars, no moon, no passing cars humming from afar, like usual. Fairhaven had sunk into a silence so complete you could hear the wall clock ticking in Margaret's kitchen, each tick-tock ringing through the house like proof that time still moved, even if everything else had paused. Upstairs, Karen shifted restlessly in bed. Her sleep had grown thin since the white van appeared that morning. Her mind couldn't truly rest. Axel lay at the foot of the bed as always, head on his forelegs, eyes closed but not sleeping. It was the kind of rest only dogs trained for war knew. Sleep for the body, while the senses remained wide open. Then the alarm blared. Not from their home, from several blocks away, the Fairhaven Safety Management Center is the core of the town's surveillance, alarm, and emergency systems. A shriek like something torn from an endless nightmare. It cut through the still night, jolting both Karen and Axel upright. But before they could react further, a second sound pierced the room. Cold, detached, slicing through the air like silk under a blade. From the small intercom speaker hanging in the corner of the wall, something the family only used during power outages or weather alerts, an unidentified voice sounded. It had no distinctive frequency. No human breath. It was just a sound, artificially created. "Return the property. She does not belong to you." Karen froze. Every cell in her body tightened like a guitar string tuned wrong. She couldn't tell what scared her more, the words themselves, or the fact that they didn't come from any network device connected to her home. But Axel? He was no longer lying down. He stood straight, his whole body tensed like a finely tuned muscle programmed for reaction. His ears perked high, his back arched slightly, eyes narrowed and blazing under the dim night light. But unlike previous times when he was alert, this time he was angry. Not the kind of anger a dog shows by barking loudly to scare off. It was a silent fury, the kind of feeling only a creature that knows exactly what is threatened can have and is willing to give everything to protect it. Axel stared intently at the speaker on the wall, as if he could see through it to confront the source of that voice. He didn't growl. He didn't bark, yet the air around him seemed to ripple slightly, as if his very presence created waves. Across the street, Daniel Rodriguez was startled awake in his patrol car, just in time to catch the signal from the radio. An alarm from the center sounded along with strange information. No sign of a break-in, no system breached. But every device was being controlled from outside. And the most terrifying part was, the voice that came out was not recorded by any internal log. Meaning, no one spoke. Daniel opened the car door and rushed across the street. He couldn't explain what he was facing, but his instincts told him Karen was right at the epicenter of something that had never been named. The bedroom door burst open. Karen turned to look, still sitting on the bed. Daniel gasped, his hand freezing before reaching the light switch when he saw Axel standing right in the middle of the room. He didn't turn his head. His gaze was fixed on the speaker, the very device that had just broadcast the voice demanding Karen back, as if she were not a human, but a lost possession. And in that moment, Daniel, who had stood amid shootings, who had rescued children trapped in burning cars, felt a chill down his spine. Not because of that sound, but because of the anger of a dog. No one fully understood what had happened in that room. No system recorded the frequency. No log proved that a voice had ever existed. But for Karen, who had just seen Axel no longer as a pet, but as a guardian spirit of her very life, she knew one thing. Something had declared war. And Axel, without chains, without commands, had taken his battle stance. After that night, nothing was the same. Not just because of the strange warning broadcast from a system never before tampered with, but because Karen had now become a focal point no one dared to admit. Yet no one could look away from. The quiet student living with her grandmother and an old dog was no more. She became a question mark that made an entire security agency alert, made an officer like Daniel Rodriguez abandon his principles to follow his instincts, and made a dog, trained only to obey, choose to act with his heart. 3 days after the incident, a decision was made. Daniel, after an emergency meeting with the Federal Coordination Office, agreed to move Karen to a temporary facility. An underground center-coded Facility 47, buried deep beneath the earth, originally used to house special witnesses or cases that defied ordinary explanation. The person in charge of the reception was Agent Lisa Monroe, a senior behavioral analysis psychologist with gray eyes as quiet as mist, and a voice always at a pitch just enough so no one could tell whether she was thinking or making decisions. Axel was not left behind. Despite some objections, Daniel brushed them all off with one sentence. "If you think she'll cooperate when separated from the only one who's protected her, you're talking to the wrong person." Facility 47 was unlike anywhere Karen had ever been. The entrance was hidden behind an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town, its exterior covered in moss and rusty wire mesh. But inside was a network of deep tunnels, long windowless corridors, and cold neon lights, like the veins of a giant creature living underground. Lisa led the three, Karen, Daniel, and Axel, to a private area. The door opened, and at that moment, Karen froze. She said nothing. She just took a deep breath and gripped Axel's leash tightly, as if he were the last tether anchoring her to reality. The bedroom before her was not a temporary shelter, but her very childhood room. Peeling wallpaper murals, the curved white-painted iron bed frame, faded floral curtains, and even the crack in the ceiling corner from a leak when she was 5 or 6. All were there the same. Daniel immediately turned to Lisa. "Explain." Lisa showed no surprise. She only exhaled softly, eyes still watching Karen's slightest reactions. "This is a process called environmental memory recall," she said evenly. "For cases of deeply blocked memory, we don't ask the girl what happened. We let the room ask for her. How do you know such detailed things?" Lisa turned to Daniel, her eyes shifting slightly for the first time. "We don't know," she said quietly. "It self-completes. We just enter the birth date, birthplace, and mother's name. The rest is reconstructed by the system's AI from databases with untraceable sources." Karen stepped into the room. She did not cry, but Axel seemed to hesitate at the threshold. His ears lowered slightly, nose wrinkled, and instead of following Karen like always, he stood still and took a long, deep breath, not to seek a familiar scent, but as if recognizing one so familiar it was terrifying. Axel turned to look at Daniel, and in that moment, his eyes held something no one had ever seen. Not fierce, not panicked, but a silent warning so clear it seemed to slow the very air. Karen sat on the bed. She reached out to touch the cold iron frame, the place where she once dreamed of her mother, of the intact days. Then, a sudden image flashed in her mind. Another corner of the room, where the window once had a safety screen, but now did not. She stood and walked to that corner. Axel quietly followed, still not taking his eyes off the wall. She touched the white patch of wall. At that moment, the paint crumbled away. Beneath it was not concrete, but a cold, metallic surface. Daniel drew his gun, Lisa rushed forward but was too late. A click echoed from inside the wall, then a breath, not mechanical, but someone or something waiting. Axel jumped up to shield Karen, fur bristling, and for the first time growled a deep growl that made the room's air seem to contract. That room was not just a memory trap, but a replica of an alternate reality dimension where everything was recorded, cloned, and staged just to lure a little girl exactly as planned. And now, they all realized, that Karen had never left the memory. The memory was still alive, and it wanted her back. After the tense moment when the cold wall behind the memory room cracked, everyone was evacuated from the experimental space. The room, recreated down to every detail of Karen's childhood, was now locked, and the underground floor isolating it was sealed off for analysis. No one clarified what had been triggered, but Lisa Monroe no longer maintained her previous calm, and Daniel couldn't take his eyes off Karen and Axel for a second. They were taken to a secure observation room deeper inside the center. A simple room. Metal table, large screen, soft white light, and the steady hum of the air conditioner like the heartbeat of the facility itself. Axel lay close to Karen's chair, never leaving her side, a vigilant gaze as if just emerged from the front line. After contacting the high-level data analysis center, Lisa gained access to a file long locked decades ago. A file labeled DARPA Vertical Bar Classified Vertical Bar Subject E92. She entered the password, scanned her retina, and a soft beep sounded. The screen lit up. Then the first image appeared, making no one in the room breathe normally anymore. A 12-second video. In it, a child, just a few months old, lay in a crib in a brightly lit closed room, surrounded by advanced medical devices with no commercial labels. The baby neither cried nor smiled, but those big round eyes looked straight into the camera as if fully aware of being recorded. Next to the crib, a German shepherd puppy, just weaned, ears floppy, fur soft like a rabbit's, curled up. A caption ran across the bottom. Pairing cycle 001, subject E92, Karen Carter. K9A901, Axel. Initial bonding occurred as predicted. Daniel read aloud. His hand tightened slightly. Lisa remained silent, eyes glued to the image as if witnessing something that should not exist. Karen looked at Axel, the dog now raising his head, seemingly staring at the image of his younger self. No explanation was needed, though without memory, without conscious recall, some piece deep within Karen's eyes recognized the impossible truth. She and Axel had been together. From before she could speak, before she knew what the world was. Lisa opened the next data section. This time it was a research log saved as technical notes. Project ORIGIN, funded by DARPA, coordinated with the Deep Behavioral Regulation Institute. Objective: create innate bonds between humans and animals and activate reflex responses to nonverbal threats. First successful pairing. Subject E92. Karen Carter, born April 2012. K9A901. German Shepherd, genetically enhanced stress-resistant breed. Biological response level: 91.6% neural similarity under neonatal conditions. Lisa switched off the screen. The room fell silent, as if the very air held back something that shouldn't be spoken. "He's," Karen said, her first words after an hour. "He was there from the start. From the very start." Her voice was not that of a child hearing a strange story, but of someone reclaiming a stolen piece of life. Axel gently rubbed his head against her hand. No whimper, no need for words. But something in that silence made Lisa instinctively look away, as if witnessing a feeling too primal, too deep to be exposed under this cold, artificial light. Daniel took a deep breath. If that project existed, who cut it off? And why? Lisa only quietly answered, "Maybe because it worked too well." The question was no longer how Karen and Axel had once been together. It was, who tried to make them forget? And why now, when everything thought buried deep, Was something trying to pull them back? Beyond the data layer, some systems were still open, still watching, and perhaps still waiting for Axel to return to his place, K9A901. The unit guarding a child is no longer a citizen, but property. The next morning, in the Level 3 security area of Facility 47, a man entered through the lead-lined double doors. No introduction was needed, but his presence instantly shifted the atmosphere in the room. He was tall, with closely cropped hair, wearing a military leather jacket faded by years, and walking with a straight back as if still bearing a rank. But what made Lisa pause, and Daniel tighten his grip on his belt, was not his appearance as a veteran, but his eyes. James Jackson, the man who had served in the Defense Department's K9 unit, had returned. Lisa pulled out a file. "You were a senior coordinator of the Bond Protocol subproject," she stated directly. "We discovered you are the only surviving member of the original K9A901 training team." James did not deny it. He only nodded slightly. "Axel still remembers me, right?" No one answered immediately. At that moment, Axel, lying next to Karen's chair, suddenly stood up. He did not bark, did not growl or get excited as if greeting an old owner. He simply stood like a soldier seeing his former commander return to the front lines. A look enough to choke James Jackson. They sat in the interrogation room, but the conversation wasn't an interrogation. It was more like a spiritual excavation, pulling fragments of memory from layers of dust and fear. "The first day I met Axel," Jackson said, eyes fixed on the dog sitting by Karen. "He wasn't named yet, just a pilot batch, born from a stabilized gene program, without a mother, without a kennel. He was created, not to be a companion, but to become a human's sixth sense reflex." Daniel interjected. "And Karen, no, Subject E92? James exhaled deeply, as if the name carried the weight of an old debt. "I don't know her real name. We weren't allowed to, but I was responsible for operating the first test phase, what later became known as the Bond Protocol." Lisa frowned. "Creating a bond between dogs and infants? Why infants?" James looked up, his voice dropping. "Because at that age, consciousness isn't formed, but the heart already knows love. And emotional reflex, if properly calibrated, can become a stronger bridge than any command code." He paused, then glanced at Karen. "I once saw this girl, when she was just crawling, cry hysterically because she heard Axel whimpering in the next room. No one taught her that. No one showed her what that whimper meant. But she knew. And this dog stopped crying just because he felt the pain of his little friend. That's not training. That's something beyond programming." Karen said nothing, but her hand gently squeezed Axel's ear. He did not turn back, but his body pressed lightly against her leg, enough for Lisa to realize that everything Jackson said was no myth. It was present, vivid, and breathing right before their eyes. Daniel leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. If the program was that effective, why was it cut? James looked at him for a long moment, then slowly placed his hand on the table. "Because of something you will soon realize. A child and a dog, if properly connected, can see what adults try to ignore. They feel the danger before it manifests. And most importantly, they act without words." Lisa lowered her gaze. Inside her, a silent question arose. The fear they all shared. If that connection couldn't be controlled, would it protect or attack when pushed to the limit? Jackson stood up. "I'm not here to retell old stories, but to help." Daniel looked at him suspiciously. "Help with what?" Jackson stared directly at Karen, then at Axel, still silent, but ears now perked. "He hasn't been fully awakened yet. The third-gen genome of the Bond Protocol has a natural lockdown mechanism, only unlocked when the partner's signal reaches a danger level 5 threshold. She's never truly remembered, and Axel is still waiting for her to speak." Karen tilted her head slightly. "I don't understand." James smiled softly, eyes speaking to a young warrior. "But he understands." In the corner of the room, Axel tilted his head as if receiving a very private signal. Not from a human, but from the deepest instinct within himself. The awakening had only just begun. That day, Facility 47 was heavy with an oppressive atmosphere, as if the concrete walls themselves were holding back something unnamed. Lisa Monroe seemed to have stayed awake all night, her eyes sunken as she reviewed every data layer of the Bond Protocol project. Daniel Rodriguez silently checked each security log, as if sensing a breach would open from within, not from any external enemy. And then it happened. At 3:12 p.m., during an emotional response test session for Karen in the Level 2 experimental room, the system detected an object moving in the North Corridor, a passage supposedly used only for technical operations, with no connection to the biological testing area. Before anyone could intervene, the door to Karen's test room opened. No alarm. No intrusion signal. And then it appeared. A German shepherd dog, the same size, the same gestures, even the dark fur around the left eye exactly like Axel. Karen sat motionless on the chair. No one else was in the room with her. No microphone from the control room, just a faint static in the air. She stared at the creature. It approached, stepping lightly as if it knew the place well. Its black-brown eyes stopped before her, a look programmed to trigger memories, to deceive. But Karen did not rush to reach out. From the control room, Lisa Monroe suddenly stood up. On the surveillance screen, a warning flashed bright red. Unauthorized entity detected, K9 beta active. She rushed to the control panel and opened internal comms. Disconnect room 7. Lock down the system immediately. Daniel and James, I need you two at the test area now. But no one reacted faster than Axel, the real dog resting beside James Jackson in the coordination room. As soon as he heard the voice from the system, Karen's trembling tone, "Are you Axel?" It was as if a call from deep inside him echoed. No command, no name is called. Axel sprang up and raced down the long corridor, claws tapping on the concrete floor like a drumbeat, waking something long sealed. Inside the test room, K9 Beta, the perfect AI clone, sat before Karen, trying to assume a friendly posture level 3. But Karen did not touch it. She whispered very softly, "You don't breathe." K9 Beta tilted its head, mimicking a familiar response. "You don't have a scent," she continued, lightly touching its nose, a gesture seeming gentle, but Karen's eyes gradually turned cold. "You're not him." At that moment, the door burst open. The real Axel charged in, not growling, not barking, not attacking. He stood between Karen and the clone, eyes locked on the copy. Two dogs like mirror images facing each other. But no fight, no blood, only their eyes. K9 Beta, programmed with millions of emotional simulation sequences, tried to recreate a look of intimate communication. But the real Axel stood there, silent, steady like a living shield. Then he bowed his head, gently, not to the opponent, but to Karen, as if saying, "I'm here. Nothing can replace this." Karen sat down, hugging his neck. Tears didn't fall, but her eyes shimmered as if finding again a voice stolen since birth. On the system screen, Karen's emotional index immediately surpassed the threshold, not from fear, but from genuine emotional recognition. An error message appeared in K9 Beta's control data, emotional match failure, terminating simulation. K9 Beta blinked, pulled its head back slightly, then quietly sat down, its eyes dimming, as if it knew the truth could not be programmed. Axel lunged forward, not growling, not barking, no need to attack. He just silently stood as a shield before Karen, body like living armor, eyes locked on the opposing copy. Two beings identical in every detail, like mirror images, now faced off not with claws or teeth, but with the only thing left between real and fake. A gaze. Lisa sat down, exhaling. "We can copy everything, but we cannot clone trust," Daniel nodded. "And we cannot program love." Elsewhere in the system, a weak signal was just cut off. Someone watching was displeased, but they knew if they wanted to reclaim their property, they had no choice left. They had to confront what they created but could not control. A child is thought to be a model, and a dog is thought to be just a tool. The day Caleb Turner was brought to Facility 47, the sky was gray like a morning veil slowly drifting over the northern mountain range. A cold wind whipped thin dust against the glass wall where Lisa Monroe stood motionless, gazing down at the helicopter landing pad. The boy sat curled up in a thin cloak, hands clutching a worn, stuffed bear, the only thing found with him during his sudden appearance at the border checkpoint. 6 months earlier, Caleb vanished without a trace. 6 months later, he returned carrying nothing but absolute silence. No signs of beating, no injection marks, no injuries. But his eyes were the one thing no longer belonging to an 8-year-old child. They were dull and empty, as if a cold hand had erased the last piece of human left inside him. Daniel Rodriguez met him first, in the medical assessment room. Caleb didn't look at him, didn't turn, didn't move even slightly when the doctor placed a stethoscope on his chest. Only a slow, steady heartbeat, but drained like a soul-sucked lake. Jackson only stood outside the door. He had seen shocked children, abused children, and even children forced to become things no one wanted to remember. But what Caleb carried was not fear. It was a frozen wasteland so cold there was no room for fear itself to exist. On the third day, Karen met him. Unplanned, unarranged. She was walking Axel down the B-level corridor when the surveillance room door opened, and Caleb stood there, with Lisa on his right and a female doctor too afraid to touch him on his left. Karen looked at him. Axel looked at him. No one spoke, until suddenly Caleb's knees buckled. Not from pain, nor from tripping, but as if those small legs had just touched a memory so real, so close, that his whole body no longer had the strength to stand. Caleb fell, not crying aloud, only a thin, muffled sound coming from deep within, like sobs held back from a very deep place. His skinny shoulders trembled slightly, then very slowly he reached out, calling Axel as if by a reflex long etched into his subconscious, even before he knew how to speak. No one reacted in time. Karen only stepped back as Axel rushed toward Caleb like a soft wind. No barking, no jumping, just lying down gently, pressing his nose against the boy's hand. And Caleb hugged him. For the first time in 6 months, he hugged a living being. It took many hours afterward when there were no cameras, no two-way glass, no lights shining on every reaction, for Lisa to decide to let Karen and Caleb stay in the small room with a real window, where sunlight pierced through leaves, where thick carpets and faint smells of baked goods lingered, and where Axel breathed evenly at their feet. Karen sat quietly. Axel lay between them. Caleb curled at the other end, hands gripping Axel's back, as if letting go would send him falling back into a place no one named. Then his voice rose very softly, as if each sound had to cross a dead land. It wasn't a normal bus. Karen didn't interrupt. Caleb looked into Axel's eyes, then continued as if recounting a waking dream. It had no back door, no rear-view mirror either. When I sat down, I looked outside but saw nothing but a screen. They said it was the world, but when I hit the glass, nothing shook. I tried to open the door, but there was no handle. The seat didn't move. I tried yelling, but no one heard. Then a voice echoed, "Let your memory be removed. We will replace it with a better version." Karen frowned. Caleb squeezed Axel's back tighter. They called it the emotional simulation station. They created another me, then sent it home instead of me. The real me was kept for experiments. To see if the other me failed, would I still recognize who I was? Karen almost held her breath. But then there was a dog. Not like Axel, but it looked at me like he does now. It started reacting differently to commands. It got me out of the simulation area but was locked inside by the system. I don't know if it's still alive, but without it, I couldn't come back. Lisa Monroe heard all this from the observation room. Her heart felt heavy as old reports about the suspended hidden high-level emotional model program resurfaced, like ghosts stirring in still water. She turned to Daniel, asking quietly, "That boy wasn't programmed, not brainwashed. He was just forgotten, wasn't he?" Daniel didn't answer. He only looked at Karen, the girl who was silent for the first 5 months of her life, because no one heard her, and Axel, the dog who never needed to speak to be trusted. Caleb said no more. He fell asleep right on the carpet, knees against Axel's belly. Karen covered him with a wool blanket. No one spoke further, only steady breathing, like a life's rhythm being sewn back together. Slowly, quietly, each stitch of love piercing the rough skin of a child returned from a place with no escape. And Axel still lay there, as if he understood some gates could only open from within if one patiently waited. For years in the field, Monroe had seen countless reports about emotional simulation artificial intelligence models, from children reprogrammed to memories designed to replace unwanted pasts. But never had she seen a machine that could replace the look Caleb gave Axel, the unnamed emotion powerful enough to silence every system into retreat. That night, when the facility had sunk into silence, Monroe sat alone before the control interface, fingers lightly scrolling through rows of encrypted files from the old program called Bond Protocol. And at line 172, a name appeared. Echo. A project once deemed too dangerous to continue. Echo was not human, but not entirely machine either. She was created from the neural and biological behavior map of Karen, backed up from the early days of the test program, before anyone thought a child and a dog could develop a bond beyond language. Echo had Karen's walk, Karen's voice, Karen's emotional reflexes, but lacked pain, memory, and most importantly, Axel. The next morning, the last bus stop on Cedar Street was secretly sealed off. An observation watch began, not to welcome passengers, but to await the reaction of something outside any official transport system. Echo stood there in the early winter chill, hair loose at shoulder length, shoulders wrapped in a familiar moss-green jacket, backpack in hand like any normal schoolchild, eyes wide open but inside only the perfect reproduction of a waiting expression. No one knew that in those eyes, no memory had ever truly lived. In the surveillance van 2 blocks away, Monroe, Jackson, and Rodriguez tracked every transmitted parameter. Stable blood pressure, normal reflexes, proper skin temperature, all like a real Karen standing and waiting for a bus. But Axel was absent. Karen was absent. And that was the prerequisite. Because if there was a being carrying real memory present, the system might never appear. 7:11 a.m. The space grew so silent that every sound seemed strangled. Then the bus arrived. No engine noise, no brakes, just a cold, lead-colored metal block gliding as if it had always been there, just waiting for someone to see it. Black windows, unmarked bodies, doors that did not open, mirrors reflecting no shadows, just an object shaped like a vehicle, but belonging to no route on any map. Echo lifted a foot in a step, simulating hesitate, wait, move forward. Hands gripped the backpack tighter. Eyes widened by 0.2 millimeters, exactly as programmed for Karen recognizing something unusual. But the bus didn't stop, didn't slow down. No heat response, no door signal. Just a slow glide past, as if the system was scanning, then dismissing. On the screen, a command appeared. Signature not matched. No origin bond detected. Subject echo equals deviation. Then the bus vanished around the street corner, where the security camera only caught a vague shadow. Echo remained standing, expression unchanged, but all internal response modes had shut down. In the surveillance van, Monroe clenched her fist, eyes fixed on the scrolling numbers. They're not looking for a person. They're looking for a bond formed from the root. They don't need a girl like Karen. They need Karen herself. In the break room, Karen was reading a book. Axel lay at her feet, head resting on a pillow, eyes half closed but awake. In that quiet passing moment, she unconsciously stroked his spine, a movement so instinctive yet painfully genuine, because no system can teach a child how to love a living being. Just as no algorithm can teach a dog to wait if its heart has never once stirred with true affection. And that was exactly what the bus or any copy of it could never simulate. When the control screen blinked the final access command, Lisa Monroe sat still as if turned to stone. She had opened hundreds of files in her life and witnessed dead data presented as if it were alive. But this time was different. Beneath that cold digital interface was something beyond the limits of control models, a witness to an error never corrected. The file name appeared, Harper Initiate 92. Not Karen Carter, not an ordinary child, but the ID code of a unit once programmed, monitored, and withdrawn from the bond protocol with the sole conclusion: uncontrollable emotional response beyond design. In the system, Harper was the category for children selected to form long-term biological bonds with K9s in a simulated environment. That girl, only a few months old, was placed in a sterile white room where every first movement was recorded as raw data. And then, in that cold, dry space, Axel, then less than a year-old K9, entered her life. They didn't play like children playing with dogs. They grew up as two beings connected by a bond needing no name and no teaching. No command code programmed Axel to rest his head on Karen's lap every afternoon she cried. No code required him to turn when she lightly touched his collar, and no one expected that a dog, born to obey, would choose not to leave a child when the system decided to separate them from the program. Monroe watched the screen, where a clear status line read, Harper Initiate 92, active, retrieval phase initiated. No alarm sounded. No red warning. Just a simple, chilling truth. The system had never stopped. It didn't need to search for Karen as a person. It was calling back unfinished software. An open loop. A living code circulates outside the system. In the courtyard behind the center, Karen sat beneath an ancient oak tree, where the late afternoon sun slanted across her stretched legs. Axel lay beside her, not resting his head on her lap as usual, but with his chin close to the ground, eyes half closed, breathing steady as if holding the entire world around her from breaking. He was not asleep. Could not sleep. He knew something was coming back. Not a tangible enemy, but something invisible, like an echo from the past, that once tried to take Karen from him and now tried once more. Daniel Rodriguez watched quietly from afar. He didn't understand all the technical terms, but he understood his eyes. He had seen the eyes of children just escaped from places no one should enter. But Karen's eyes were different. They weren't shattered, not panicked. They were like a door opening, not to run away, but to welcome back something that once belonged to her. And he knew, in that moment, that Axel was the remaining part of that memory, the part no one could simulate. Monroe stepped out into the yard, holding the printed Harper file. She said nothing, just placed it on the wooden table beside Karen, then looked straight at Axel. No words needed. Her eyes said it all. You know, don't you? Axel did not growl or bark. He simply turned his head gently to rest it on Karen's leg. A small movement, but in it lay a silent declaration. If they come back, I'm still here. If they call her, I won't let her go alone. Because of all these years, Axel had never been taught how to love. Yet he loved. And Karen was never taught how to resist a system. But in every step she took, each glance back at the old dog was a reply. I do not belong to those codes. The Harper Initiate file might be a sequence of commands, a technical scar, a program flaw. But for Karen, it was just a strange name never hers. And for Axel, it was an unspoken promise, kept in every breath, every stance guarding danger, every night lying silently by her bed without demand. Regardless of the outcome, only knowing, he would not let anyone take away what love had guarded with life itself. They descended to the lowest floor of the base as twilight faded through frosted glass panes. leaving a thin light like scattered ash at day's end. Under the spiral staircase leading underground, a steel door locked by 3 layers of code and 2 biometric authentications. No one had entered here in over 8 years, but Monroe knew what awaited them was beyond any defense protocol. It was older than technology, quieter than threats, memory. They walked down a long corridor, walls stark white and bare, lit by a single row of recessed ceiling lights casting onto concrete floors. The light didn't fall on the ground, but seemed to hover in the dense, sterile air. No footsteps echoed, only Axel's steady breathing. He led, neither running nor overreacting, each movement measured by the intuition of an animal seasoned by countless life-and-death missions. At the corridor's end, a room appeared, shielded by radiation-proof lead curtains, the only place no light could penetrate. When Monroe pulled back the curtain, everything fell into another dimension. No control panels, no white walls, and no data center. Before Karen was the familiar childhood bedroom, from the fox-shaped night lamp to the crudely drawn paper taped to the wall. But not a copy. Every scratch, every fold, every trivial detail was exact, as if someone had sliced a piece of time, frozen it, then quietly reconstructed it underground. Karen froze. For a moment, her heartbeat shattered into silent voids. No one spoke. Rodriguez stood behind, quietly placing a hand on her shoulder. Monroe did not enter. Only Axel moved forward, to the corner rug where Karen used to sit reading, and sat as if nothing had changed. Then a voice rang out. "Daddy's girl is here." She spun around. No need to look to know who it was. That voice, warm and slightly hoarse, had echoed every night she had high fevers and whispered comfort when she feared stepping on stage for her first performance. And now it filled this recreated space like a punch to the mind. Too real, too familiar, too timely. Out from behind the illusion's veil stepped the man, her father, in the last form she remembered. Graying hair, worn plaid shirt collar, and a smile tilted to one side. "You okay?" he asked, as if time had never passed, as if nothing was wrong. Karen stood rigid, her whole body taut like a stretched string, but her eyes shimmered as if about to break. She knew this wasn't him. She knew well, but her heart did not. It only remembered, and it beat with a flutter no explanation could control. Axel rose, stretched slowly, and then looked back at Karen. His eyes held no command, no coercion, just a silent question. "Are you sure?" Not doubting, but sensing. The air in this room wasn't from reality. It came from repeating data. A simulation run by Karen's memories, stored without her knowing. Monroe whispered to herself, "They don't need to capture her. They only need to make her not want to leave. This was a trap without chains or force. It used the one thing all technology fails against, unfinished feelings." Karen slowly stepped toward the image of her father. Each step laid upon cracking memories. She reached out, and as if by reflex, the man's hand reached out too. Their fingertips neared, less than an inch apart. But just before her fingers touched, Axel barked, a short, low sound, not loud but striking straight into her lost emotional center. Karen froze. She looked down to see his eyes, not judging, not opposing, just the eyes of a friend, calling her home. A look that said, "You've survived this far. Don't lose yourself to something that can only exist by holding you back." Karen withdrew her hand. The father's image still smiled. Neither vanished nor reacted, just stood there as if still believing she'd return. But she did not. She turned back to Axel, bent down, placed her hand on his head, and whispered what only 2 souls programmed then escaped together could understand. "Thank you for not leaving me." The room began to tremble softly. No alarms, but the system understood. The target refused access. The simulation began to dissolve. The light dimmed. Objects dissolved like mist. The room returned to its original emptiness, a cold data box abandoned with memories no longer manipulable. Karen stood, Rodriguez beside her. Monroe looked at both with eyes no longer of a commander, but of one who had witnessed the only thing no simulation system could reproduce. Free will, guided by a dog thought only loyal, but who turned out to be the last gatekeeper between illusion and life. Because sometimes, what keeps us from getting lost in a maze without exits isn't answers, but a gaze that knows when to say, "Don't go further." As they left the simulation room, the air in the corridor seemed to thicken, not with physical cold, but with a layer of space clinging tightly to unspoken thoughts. Karen didn't look back, but Monroe knew. Even though the girl said nothing, some part of Karen's mind had just closed a door that had been open throughout her childhood, the door to things beyond saving. And that, more than any technical progress or psychological intervention, was proof that this girl had stepped beyond the code written for her. Back in the control room, the central programming screen flared, like a fury over an unfinished process. A red message flashed repeatedly. Harper Initiate 92:return to model or restart loop. A forced choice, a reminder that the system never knew escape, only return or restart. Karen stared at the string of commands, hands gripping the leash as if it were the last tether holding reality together. Axel stood beside her, not barking, not growling, not showing worry, but his whole body leaned slightly forward, as if ready to leap if anything in this room dared approach her. No one told Axel to do this. He didn't need programming to know when a human must be protected by his own body. Monroe stood behind, her gaze no longer that of an agent. It held something almost like gratitude and quietness. She looked at Karen like a woman who once trusted simulation models, now facing something beyond all mechanisms. Free choice. "So, what will you do?" Rodriguez asked, his voice low and slow, not commanding but a bridge for Karen to step forward. She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were still fixed on the lines of code like living scars, each character representing a dream edited, a memory replaced, each time her heart was turned by the system into an algorithm predicting emotional response. Karen stepped up to the console, small hands placed on the glass, the light reflecting a blue streak on her cheek. Then she spoke, not as a declaration, but a truth she had just reached deep within. "I am not a copy. I am the chooser." The words sounded quiet, but enough to make the whole system seem to pause for a moment. Axel lifted his head. His ears stood tall. Silence hung like before a storm. Karen did not use a kill code, did not enter a shutdown command. She stepped back and took from her pocket a folded piece of paper, the first drawing she and her father ever made together. A dog standing under a porch next to a girl holding a leash. Not detailed, not perfect, just a few ink smudges. But it was real. More real than any model the system had ever created. She pressed the paper onto the control panel. The screen did not react, but in that moment, a flicker, thin as a hair, ran along the data edge. The disconnect command flashed red. The program block began to dissolve, not due to system error, but because faith cannot be processed by any code. The whole center trembled softly. No alarms, no chaos, just something deeper unraveling. The blind belief that humans can be replicated by algorithms. Karen turned to Axel and sat down level with him. She said nothing, but her eyes held a life returned to the rightful keeper. Axel needed no reply. He stepped forward, gently pressed his forehead against hers, a gesture so ancient neither knew when it formed, as a signal. "I am here. You have chosen, and I will go with you." Behind them, the system shut down piece by piece. Simulation models were turned off one by one. Images of virtual children vanished. Programmed voices fell silent. No one spoke an ending. But in that silence, one truth was etched, clearer than any encoded data. A girl had chosen to trust her dog, and from that destroyed a whole simulated world with the only thing impossible to program: real love. Since the moment she destroyed the modeling protocol, Karen's days passed in strange silence. No flickering interface, no coordinating voices echoing through the internal system, no pursuit by numbers trying to rewrite memory. Yet the farther she moved from control, the more she felt she was approaching something. Not a door, not an enemy, but a faint call from the last piece never opened. And the first to notice, as always, was Axel. For many nights before, he no longer lay sleeping by the foot of the bed as usual. Instead, he stayed awake, silently standing by the window frame, ears perked in the wind, eyes contemplative, watching an invisible space. He didn't scratch the door, didn't growl, but something in the way he observed, the tensing muscles, the slight tilt of his head at a distant sound, told Karen that the signal was near. And then it appeared, not as urgent data or system notification, just a single code packet, unencrypted, broadcast from a coordinate erased from the administrative map. An old communication station deep in the dead forest. Once a military command center decades ago, now just a decaying concrete ruin nobody cared about. Few knew about that station. Monroe frowned, saying such spots were often used as temporary cache stations, places where the system saved the last copies before wiping everything clean. Rodriguez hesitated, but finally let her go. Not as a child to protect, but as the only one who could hear and understand that final echo. And as always, Axel went along. No one asked. The journey took 3 days, crossing the once-blocked forest where warning signs had rotted into unreadability, muddy roads overgrown with moss, broken antenna towers lying silent like the backbone of a giant beast asleep underground. Each step deeper felt like walking backward through a part of the past, layer upon layer, until reality blurred by something both nostalgic and uneasy. The communication station is nestled in an old hillside, its entrance almost hidden by vines and shrubs. Karen carefully stepped down underground, where a rusty iron door opened by her biometric sensor, a detail that made her shiver. Someone had programmed this entrance to wait for her. No one else. Inside was a small room. No servers, no control panels, only one device. An old data block, palm-sized, glowing faint pale blue like dying embers. When Karen placed her hand on it, no password, no barrier. Everything opened as if it knew she would come. Inside wasn't code or military orders, no behavioral models, and no biometric reports. Just a photograph. Blurry, with a singed top right corner, but unmistakable. Karen, 5 years old, in a white striped dress, hugging a small dog, eyes radiant, still unknowing of fear or loss. And Axel, much younger, shiny black fur unscarred, looking up at her with expression words could not capture. A mix of instinct, intuition, and something like a promise. Karen held the photo with both hands. A real paper photo, not digital. She saw small scratches on the corner, the scent of old paper, and a faint ink smear on the left edge. Then, just below the photo, a line appeared. Not on the screen, but handwritten on the bottom edge. The pattern ends with choice. You chose. No sender name, no timestamp, no system ID. But Karen understood. Not logically, but with a deep feeling in her chest, like a whisper from someone once close behind her neck. That's right. You did the right thing. Axel approached. Without being called, he gently placed his head on her lap, eyes shining with something close to empathy. No analysis, no reason, because he was part of that choice. And now, with the virtual world fallen, with simulation stopped, with every algorithm that once defined her erased, what remained was this: a girl and her dog, sitting underground, holding each other, with a photo proving love had once been real, and the choice made by the heart. Karen folded the photo and placed it in her breast pocket, closest to her heart. No one needed to know. No reports, no announcements, because the most sacred thing wasn't the data found, it was the silence afterward. She stood, Axel at her side. No one leading. They just walked on. And for the first time, Karen didn't think about who she was or where she was created from. She only thought, we chose each other, and that is enough. The world kept spinning without care. That afternoon, as they left the forest, Karen and Axel said nothing. They walked side by side like two parallel footprints on damp earth. No sound, no clear purpose, just pure companionship that needed no words. The chill wind carried the scent of dry pine and the faint sounds of tiny life in a forest once forgotten. But inside Karen, things were not yet calm. The photo in her breast pocket still felt warm, like it had a heartbeat, and Axel's gaze occasionally flicked toward her, as if to remind her that one last thing remained unsaid. Rodriguez met them at the rendezvous, a wooden hut near the forest edge that once served as a ranger's checkpoint, now a resting place for those unwilling to enter the city. He didn't ask about the data block, and didn't need to know what had been found. He simply handed Karen a cup of hot tea, then fell silent for a long moment, his eyes following Axel's figure sitting a few meters away, eyes half closed, ears still tuned to every smallest movement in the forest. You know, Rodriguez said quietly, almost like a confession, Axel wasn't the first case paired with a child. Karen looked up, brow slightly furrowed. Before you, there were many other experiments. Other children, other dogs, all part of a larger project called Echo Line, aimed at finding an absolute connection between humans and animals, where commands don't need to be spoken and emotions don't need programming to be understood. He pulled an old map from his jacket and opened it on the chipped wooden table, finger gliding over faded red dots. This is the list of K9 dogs that participated in the program. More than 20 individuals, each trained, sensor-equipped, and linked to a cloned subject. But only 4 pairs maintained the bond past the first year, and among those 4, only 1 dog returned to its true partner without commands or coordinates. Karen said nothing, but her gaze turned to Axel. Yes, Rodriguez nodded slowly as if he had never believed it until now. It's Axel. We don't understand how he did it. When the system collapsed, most others either lost control or were recalled. Only Axel not only survived, but found his way back. Found you. Even after erased memories, new names, new places, he still recognized you. Karen bowed her head, not to hide tears, but in gratitude. Rodriguez stood and stepped toward Axel. The dog remained seated, eyes closed, motionless, as if sensing a solemn moment. The young officer knelt, not reaching out, just tilting his head, a kind of informal bow, not military ceremony, but bearing deeper meaning than any medal, a true act of respect. You're a soldier, Axel, he whispered, not for what you did on command, but for what you chose to do for one person. Karen needed no explanation. In a world where everything can be programmed, what comes from the heart? Unconditional loyalty, the ability to recognize the one you love, and the willingness to die to protect them, is something that can never be replicated. And if a soldier walks through the darkness to keep someone alive in the light, then Axel long ago became a soldier needing no honors, only to be beside Karen. That was the only reward he chose, and the only reward this world lacked the right to grant. When night fell, the fire in the wooden hut burned low. Karen sat by the window, hand resting lightly on Axel's back, not to hold him back, but as if seeking the steady beat amid all that had been revealed. She didn't ask Rodriguez anything more, for everything to hear and understand was already in the quiet gaze of the dog dozing at her feet, a silent testament that sometimes instinct is more truthful than any system. Yet something lingered, a hollow echo not yet silenced in a dream. Then Monroe called. Her voice through the satellite link carried seriousness with no emphasis, just a few simple words. I found 3 E-series files not yet erased. Karen said nothing, only waited. E87, E104, and E110, Monroe continued, each number brushing past Karen's heart. 3 children, true identities unknown, but their gene sequences match the Echo Line model, Based on scattered data traces, they may be still active, or held in endless simulation. Rodriguez looked up. Karen clenched the fabric of the nearby chair. At that moment, all old emotions returned. Invisibility, helplessness, the feeling of being controlled by something beyond understanding. But then her eyes met Axel's deep brown ones, unchanged, silent, needing no questions or analysis. And in those eyes, Karen found what all protocols never taught her. Choice doesn't come from what's easy, but what's right. "We cannot abandon anyone," she said. "Not as a survivor, but as one bearing the responsibility to survive for those who can no longer speak." Monroe was silent for a moment, then nodded, one word: "Prepare." Rodriguez turned away, starting to contact Allied units. Karen didn't move. She just sat there, hand still on Axel's back, feeling each steady breath as a sign of life amid what had been forged, blurred, and faded. Axel opened his eyes. He did not bark. He didn't need to know the names of those 3 children, or if they still existed intact like Karen. He only knew, if someone awaited being brought into the light, he would be the first to go, to lead, to scent every strange trail, to shield every step, just as he had when Karen was a child who didn't even remember her true name, because for Axel, life is not measured by heartbeats, but by what one chooses to protect. And this time, Karen had chosen not just for herself. She chose for the children who never had the chance to choose. In the old room, the fire still burned. And the smallest ones, a girl erased from data, a dog retired from duty, and an unsung soldier, were silently rewriting the final lines for a model once thought incapable of error. The tactical map was pinned to the wall. Movement routes, approach timings, and the frequency of signals from suspected simulation zones were marked with scattered red, yellow, and green dots. Monroe was to lead the special task force into central Colorado, the last place E-104 had emitted a signal. Another team would sweep the cold base in the north, where signs of E-110 appeared, though electromagnetic interference often caused the tracking system to lose connection. Karen wanted to go along, but Rodriguez did not. "Not you," he said, eyes fixed on the signal axis on the map. "Not this time." Karen remained silent. She was used to deployments, with Axel by her side, with a rushed plan, walking the thin line between control and chaos. But this time, she sensed something different. It was no longer a mission. It was a deeper shift, where the focus was no longer on where they were heading, but where they were leaving behind. Willow Ridge remained unchanged. The old wooden houses lay quietly beneath the hill, and the rows of maples rustled in the evening breeze. But since Karen and Axel returned, this place was no longer just a town. It had become a living memory, a witness to what seemed programmed to be forgotten. And like a natural reaction, it needed someone to stay, someone who woke each morning to walk the small road, not to patrol, but to keep the space from slipping away from the true pulse of humanity. Rodriguez chose to be that someone. He did not re-enlist, did not report a withdrawal, simply did not leave. He repaired the old Firewatch hut, restored the alarm system, and linked satellite communications to Monroe's remote station. No one ordered him to do so, but everyone understood. Staying was also a form of fighting, and some battles require no guns. "We need an anchor point," he told Monroe over encrypted comms. "A place where children, if still alive, can return to. If all data is lost, if no one guides them, they still must have a place to see a light and know they are awaited." Monroe did not object, for she knew only a place that once held memory, not simulated, not reconstructed, could do that. And Rodriguez, with the scar on his left cheek still unhealed, was the most suitable. Not because he was the strongest, but because he had never let go of anyone easily. To Karen, Rodriguez's presence meant a quiet kind of peace. Sometimes she stood behind curtains, watching him quietly walk home, hands in pockets, coat draped with dew, steps slow but sure like someone who had chosen the rest of his life. No glory, no explanation needed. Axel often looked away from Karen each evening to stand beside Rodriguez on the porch. No calls, no leash. Simply, some people, some creatures, need no reason to stay. And strangely, in that silence, Karen felt safer than any protection system ever built. Not because Rodriguez carried weapons, but because he had the heart of one who had walked through the darkness and chose to return to keep the light for others. They said little, but in brief moments, everything unspoken was shared. Like when Karen placed her coffee by the window and later found it gone. Like when Rodriguez left a note on her desk with the address of the supply depot in case of lost contact. Like when Axel lifted his head, looked at them both, then quietly lay down between. A silent bond between two who were no longer where their lives began, but stayed for a reason greater than themselves. Rodriguez was no longer a cop, but he was now something else. The gatekeeper. One standing between worlds, real and virtual, lived and waiting to be saved. To remind that sometimes someone must never leave, to hold on to what matters most, untouched by time. As the convoys departed, signals were activated, and the search for the 3 surviving children began. At the last point on the map, a light still shone. A small wooden house. A man waiting for no one to return, but ready to welcome. And a dog who never left the post he chose, still raising his head to hear the wind. The ceremony took place one October afternoon, when leaves began to yellow and the sky seemed to lower itself to listen more closely. The backyard of the New Haven Rescue Headquarters, the old K9 training warehouse, was set up with a simple wooden stage, flanked by American flags, and in the middle stood plaques engraved with the names of dogs who had served. Not all were alive. Not all were remembered. But today, a special name was called. Axel, K9-901, Bond Protocol, survivor. Karen stood among the rows, not in uniform, wearing only a brown sweater, simple as Axel had always loved. Not medals, but the hand that rested gently on his head each night. Axel stood quietly by her side, coat graying in places, but eyes never changed. When the MC called Emily Harper, the crowd fell silent. No one doubted. That was the girl once the center of a storm, erased from the system, found by a dog not by duty, but by love. Karen stepped forward. Her voice wasn't loud, but clear, as if each word was drawn from a memory she nearly lost. I don't remember when I first called Axel by name. Maybe when I was very small, maybe later. But what I know for sure is that he never forgot me. She paused, looking down at the dog lying at the edge of the stage, always keeping the last position, but never far away. A soft breeze stirred, carrying the rustle of flags and the steady breathing of those lost, but not forgotten. Dogs don't keep diaries. They don't recount their feats. They don't argue who's right or wrong, who deserves honor or should be forgotten, but they remember. Karen lightly squeezed the paper in her hand, then folded it. She didn't read the rest of the prepared speech. Instead, she stepped fully forward, approached Axel, and pointed to the dog lying there, eyes wide, as if the only real being left in a world once simulated. Axel remembers me, even if the world forgets who I am. No system keeps my name. No data holds the image of me as Emily Harper. But he remembers. He searched. And when he found me, he didn't ask who I had become. He only needed to know I was still breathing. Her voice faltered, but not weak. She turned toward the audience where other K9 soldiers sat. Some retired, some now only names on stone plaques. The wind swept through her hair, and in that moment, Karen was no longer a rescued victim, but a narrator telling the world that some warriors never need statues. We honor dogs for their loyalty, but perhaps what deserves more reverence is their memory, because in a world ready to erase your name for being different, memory is the bravest act. She bowed her head. No applause followed, not because the speech lacked feeling, but because no one wanted to break the sacredness filling every cell of the air. Axel still lay there, not standing, not barking, as if silently saying, "The greatest honor doesn't come from the podium, but from the eyes of the one you love still calling your name, even if just once." And with that, no more words were needed. Karen quietly returned to her seat. Rodriguez tilted his head slightly, eyes solemn as confirmation. Monroe gently clenched her hand on her lap, lips pressed tight to hold back emotion. And the soldiers, accustomed to strict discipline, only nodded slowly, a silent ritual for truth never spoken aloud. As Karen sat down, Axel edged closer, resting his head on her leg, eyes closing as if, finally, after all, he had completed his mission, bringing the one he chose back to herself. No medals are needed. Just trusting once was enough. Since that ceremony, Karen was no longer called the rescued girl. She didn't wear medals, didn't become a spokesperson, nor appeared in any news as people often do with extraordinary survivors. But at New Haven headquarters, amidst mornings thick with mist covering the wooden roofs, Karen woke early, not to recall the past, but to begin a kind of training never found in any curriculum. Axel always waited by the door, alert eyes, ready stance, as if he had never been a retired dog, but still a canine warrior on a life-or-death mission. But if anyone thought these training sessions were merely repeated physical exercises, they would never understand what was truly happening. It was not Axel being trained. It was Karen being forged. Under Monroe's guidance and the covert tactical team, Karen began learning to read the world in the language of a dog. She learned to smell through digital signals, a scent without fragrance but with frequency, learned to distinguish biological heat patterns from human simulation devices, and even practiced reacting not by human reflex, but by pure instinctive logic. The language Axel used to survive labyrinths with no escape. At first, Karen was confused. Some days she cried simply because she couldn't distinguish a real data point from a memory trap. But Axel never left her side by more than 2 steps. He didn't overreact or correct her, just observed. And whenever Karen panicked, he would lightly nudge her hand with his head, 1 tap, 2 taps, long enough for her to remember. He was still here, and the true memory was waiting for her to unlock. Gradually, Karen no longer feared charts or heat maps. She began seeing the errors in space, as Axel detected anomalies in the environment. A tiny scratch that didn't fit the scene, a breath out of sync with the wind's rhythm, a repeated knock not following natural law, all combined into a map leading to where rescue was needed, or where caution was required. In one assessment, Monroe stood quietly for a long time, watching Karen and Axel track a false data stream hidden in low-frequency waves. No one else detected it, only them. She recorded just 1 line in the strategy journal. "No one can train Karen, only Axel, and Axel doesn't teach, he connects." No one said whether Karen was being trained to replace an agent or become a permanent part of the Retrieve E campaign. But every morning, as she and Axel crossed the trail behind the camp, their slow, steady steps sounded like a countdown to something unnamed. People knew that a silent search was underway. Without fanfare, where the girl once programmed to forget was learning to remember everything through an instinct beyond memory, loyalty. And Axel, as always, did not lead, but walked beside her, because some warriors never go ahead, but never fall behind. One morning, thick mist like a thin silk veil covered the northern forest of the town. Karen wore a heavy gray coat, hair tied high, hand gripping Axel's leash, but not to lead, but to balance together the fragile border between real and unreal. On a compact mobile device, a special low-frequency signal scanner developed for the E-Series campaign, a symbol appeared, blinking blue, with coordinates unnamed. The system command read, "Origin point reactivated." Karen did not ask, Axel did not bark. They just looked at each other, then turned into the northern forest, where a year ago a doorless bus had appeared in a dream, then vanished as if it never existed. The path into the forest was gone. The grass had overgrown the old trail, ferns thickly covered as if hiding something forbidden from being touched again. But Karen walked steadily, and Axel, like that first day at the bus station, needed no leash, no command, simply walked beside her as the second heartbeat of the same soul. At the end of the path was a silent clearing. No bus, no tire marks, no oil stains. Not even the scratch marks Rodriguez had mentioned before. But both knew they were standing exactly where they should be. Karen closed her eyes. She did not call out or activate any device. She simply let herself feel, with the intuition Axel had trained daily, with memories not spoken but in the quiet touches between trust and fear. And then, as a gentle wave brushed the lower layer of reality, no sound echoed, but it was not silence. Everything just sank, as if the world paused to listen. No one stepped out. No voice called to turn back. No familiar blue light of a simulation. Just a soft breeze, and right at the forest edge, Karen saw a silent shadow standing where sunlight could not reach. Shape unclear, neither fully human nor system. But something in the air had changed. No longer hunted, but invited. As if the door didn't open by code, but by readiness. Karen looked at Axel. He stood calmly. No warning signals. No tense defense. Just looked at her, then gently nodded. And Karen understood. The first time she stepped onto that bus, she was a child programmed to forget. But now she carried all the restored fragments of memory through faith, and a dog who had never lost direction, even when the world around her was rebuilt from false codes. Karen stepped towards the clearing. Axel walked beside her, footsteps steady like a slow ticking clock. No words were spoken, because what needed saying, they had already said in their choice, choosing not to run, but to continue. And as they disappeared behind the trees, no one knew what awaited on the other side. But one thing was certain. If there was a door waiting to be closed forever, Karen and Axel were the only ones brave enough to walk through, and keep the rest of the world truly real. Some doors only open when we trust enough and have the courage to move forward, even without knowing what lies beyond. Karen was not programmed to be a hero. Axel was not trained to fight a system. But through a bond beyond words, they reminded the world that memories may fade, but loyalty never has a delete code. If you were standing before such an invisible path, would you turn back or step forward? Share your feelings below, and don't forget to like and share this story for those who believe in connections beyond words. And subscribe to the channel to not miss journeys that touch the heart like this one.